In this second instalment about talking about my match fishing memories, I want to talk about becoming a senior angler at the tender age of 16. Me and my mates, we were no longer junior members, that was all behind us, and now we were fishing just as senior anglers. We were only in one angling club, Wareham Angling Society, and there were basically four of us, all the same age, all 16-year-olds, myself, Phil Dominey, Godfrey Lovell and Richard Gamble. Things had changed a bit in the club matches. That year someone devised a new point system. Instead of the best 5 of 6 specified matches out of about maybe 8 or 10 matches, suddenly every match counted. Although that previous competition known as the Pearson Cup continued, now every match counted, and the point system was different. Instead of something like 12 for a win, 9 for second and down to 10th, and that was it. We now had a system where the number of points scored was dependent on the number of anglers. So if you won a match with 30 anglers, you got 30 points, but you also got an extra point for each pound of fish you caught. Now this sounds all very well and good, but our matches varied a great deal. Some of the matches were quite small, especially in the winter. You might only get 15 or even 12 anglers. The weights might be low, so you could win a winter match and maybe score 20 points, 18 points. But there was one match known as the John Emery, fished on the Froome above Wareham, where the fishing only opened in October. Nowadays it's sort of November, but back then it was October. So the first Sunday of October there was this big match, and lots of people came out of the woodwork just to fish this one match every year. So as a result, there was over 40 anglers on this one match. So you can see that anyone who won this match, and it was typically one with 10 to 15 pounds, would be getting over 50 points. But even if you came 10th, so you'd still get something like 33 points plus your pound, so you might come 10th with £3, get 36 points. So you got a lot more points for a modest weight in that one match. So it really skewed things. It was equivalent to 2 wins, doing moderately well. My problem was I could never draw a peg worth having in that match. I used to get the pegs where you'd catch one little grayling or a couple of dace or whatever. So for me it was a waste of time. And I had a second problem those first 2 years as a senior. I was doing exams, I was doing my O-levels and then moving on to supposedly take A-levels, which I never took. My parents weren't very keen on me going fishing on the first match of the season. Well, when the Pearson Cup with just the selected matches, that didn't count anyway, but now it did count. So for 2 years I missed that first match. So I was thinking back on it at quite a disadvantage. The guy who devised this system had worked out the previous year, 1972, that based on the fact that he stuck at it on the grimmest of matches, he'd flog away for 5 hours and maybe pull a couple of days and do well. He didn't always get the big weights, occasionally he did okay, but that he would have won the club championship the year before. He didn't allow for the fact that suddenly there's these 4 youngsters coming along who are learning very, very quickly. We're only 16, but each year we're getting 50% better than the year before. We're reading everything we can get our hands on. Ivan Marks has started his column. The year before, Kevin Ashurst had a column as well in Angler's Mail. We were getting hold of 1 or 2 match fishing books, articles in Angling magazine by Dave Burr, and we were also learning from the senior anglers. So although some of the senior anglers were dismissive of us, they didn't want us to even watch them, others were very encouraging. Bill Smith was one, a Brummie angler who'd moved down to Dorset. lovely man who would take the time out to show us how to trot. Jimmy Lee was another one, another angler from away who'd moved from Witney in Oxfordshire, who was keen on fishing with casters, and he showed us about trotting with casters. So these anglers didn't mind sharing the information, and that was really important. Others would say literally bugger off. You know, they were so worried that we were going to beat them. They should have been worried. What happened those first 2 years as seniors is that Richard of our group was club champion 2 years running. To make it even worse, the following year after that, his younger brother Steve, who by then was 16, became club champion. So it was beat the gambles. But they were doing it right. We used to call Richard Golden Balls. He seemed to have a knack of sticking at it. But he'd learnt things that myself and Phil, who fished together a great deal, could learn from. One that if you watched Richard fish, although he did get some good weights, he fished well, he was neat, he presented the bait well on the river, and he also had discovered something that perhaps we hadn't picked up. When we were bagging up with dace on the Froome, you could have maggots that were chewed to anything and you'd still catch fish. You were pulling out 100, 120 dace, and it was so easy. You could leave chewed maggots on the hook and still pull out fish. But when it was hard, you were fishing for 1 or 2 fish, 1 or 2 dace, and it could, you know, if there was a frost, that's how bad it was. What Richard said was that if he had a bite and missed it, even if the bait was unmarked, he would change the bait. That might get him the bite the next time round. He thought that the fish knew that it was a rejected bait and they wouldn't touch it. So it was just a little thing, and that was an important factor. And Richard was very, very consistent for those couple of years. After, and bear in mind we're talking about the 73 season, 74 season, then Steve winning in the 75 season. And Richard continued into the sort of 76 season. But at that point, he decided to join the Territorial Army, learn how to drive a lorry, and that became his weekend hobby. So Richard pretty much dropped out of match fishing about then. Steve had this glorious year, and then he got into playing rugby. He wasn't very big, but he was very fast. So he was whatever rugby player position that is. So he was quick. And that became his hobby, so he also dropped out of fishing. But like I say, we were learning finesse on breach. Even as juniors, we'd realised that catching these little roach and gudgeon, sensitivity was the key when it came to the floats and fine hooks to nylon size 20s, even 22s. And by making floats and also buying some floats, starting in 74, I got my first checkbook because I'd started work at Barclays. So the first thing you get is a checkbook, don't get any money for 3 weeks. And I was able to buy floats, mail order from Marks and Marlow. Bear in mind that the couple of tackle shops selling tackle in Wareham didn't really have the full range. They had floats in there from people like Denton, if anyone remembers those, which were sort of cheap copies of much better floats made by Ultra and the Ivan Marks floats. But buying floats direct from Ivan Marks' shop in Leicester, started to get things like 2mm cane antennas, stick floats, balsas, pacemakers. And we were quickly learning. We weren't fishing wagglers yet. That concept would come a bit later, and something that I'll cover on another day. But by making little antenna floats, you could buy a kit back in those days for float making. It would consist of some pieces of balsa dowel that would drilled at each end, not drilled all the way through, and some different pieces of 2mm and 3mm cane. So I quickly figured out that taking a piece of what was basically a stick float kit, a bit of 2mm cane, and then shaving it down even finer so it was less than 1mm. I had a very sensitive little antenna float that would really show these bites from shy roach on breech. So that was a big advantage for scratching out these little roach, but only catching 2.5 pounds, but over 100 fish. And me and Phil were practicing. We were cycling up there, practicing away, catching up to 100 and odd roach, and that stood us in good stead on those matches. The other two venues that we had back then were the Froome. I've said about what was known as Holme Lane, East Holme on the Froome for the grayling fishing. We really only had one big match on there a year. We might have had one more club match, and there were team matches on there. But the main summer venue and occasional winter venue was Eastmoor, just above Wareham. And the weights on there varied enormously. There were a lot more small roach around on there in the summer of 73, and down on the towpath we're getting anything up to 20 pounds of roach on bread. But Eastmoor was a lot tougher, but there were one or two better weights on there. So I can remember a match one with about I think 8 pounds and 6 pounds. But often you were really scratching on there. On a bright summer's day, you were fishing a 22 hook for a little tiny dace, trying to get a few of those to get a weight to score a few points. I don't remember many eels back then. I don't know if eels counted for a few years yet. Certainly a decade later it became almost an eel venue rather than a venue for catching dace and roach. There was one other area of the Frome that was far more important than Holme Lane and Eastmoor, and that was the area in Wareham itself. Downstream from South Bridge, there's what we call the towpath, which is the main footpath there. Very occasionally swims above the bridge were put in on the same bank on that south side. And there was also the venue on the other bank downstream of the church and priory, known as Beswall. That wasn't used very much in the coming years, but at the time we're talking about 1973 and 4, it was having its sort of final fling, if you like. There was no doubt that the towpath was a better venue than Beswall. This seems odd because it's the same bit of river, but the towpath had much more favourable winds. The winds tended to be off your back. Shallower, if anything, you had to fish further out. But it was easy with that favourable winds. The moorings were nothing like they are now, so it was fishable. About 30 swims down there. And it was fairly even. Quite often one area would be better than another. Sometimes the bottom half where the wind was right off your back, sometimes up the top end, and sometimes it didn't matter too much. But it was a venue that I certainly liked very much. Beswall tended to have one good area opposite the yacht club, and that was about it. There might be reasonable weights, one or two weights, sort of £5, £8 or whatever there, and elsewhere you'd struggle for a pound. It was that tough, and I think as the weights got better on the towpath, we tended to stick to that side. In the last video I said about a match that was won with £12 and I was sixth with £9, and that was a good example of the consistency of the towpath. There were very few roach along the towpath in matches at that time, although pleasure fishing had up to £20. There was one match in 74 when I had some roach in the summer, but mostly, especially in the winter, it was all dace pretty much. We'd yet to fish the Stour really. Started to get in because of how we'd done the year before, qualified for the team against Dorchester. But I don't know who I'd upset, because the first match, having caught a few roach for just over £1 in the first 10 minutes, I had a jack pike went through the swim and that killed it. It was a very shallow swim on the Stour, and all the roach disappeared about 100 yards downriver, way beyond a great big bed of reeds. Nothing I could do would bring them back, and all I caught after that was a couple of gudgeon. And at the end of the match, the guy running it, the guy who devised the points, said, "Oh, you're not in the team next week. You were last in the team." Although I'd beaten about 6 Dorchester guys, and I thought that's a bit off. But I was allowed to, or taken along the following week, and I caught about the 3rd or 4th best weight overall, although I was fishing as a reserve on the end of the match. And I thought, well, not that bad. And all the people who supposedly done better the week before really struggled, because I knew how to catch bleak from fishing on the Thames. So there was definitely some sort of resistance and against these up and coming youngsters. How dare they threaten our cosy little existence? Us experienced anglers, we're far better than you. We didn't have experience, but by God did we have enthusiasm. We were practicing and practicing and practicing. The following year, this sort of came to a head. I was back in the team for the first 2 matches, and then we had what was known as the Beymont Cup. And the first round, again, I couldn't get in the team, although I'd been 3rd or 4th in the championship the year before. For some reason, that wasn't good enough. I don't know what was going on there. However, one of the people I've mentioned, Bill Smith, who was, like I say, one of the fairest men I ever met, he would speak up for the underdog and he didn't like bullying. After this first match, where again I'd gone along as reserve and caught enough for 3rd place overall, when it came to the next match, he stood up in a committee meeting and gave this bloke a right rollicking. He said, "This is crazy. You got Mark here who's doing well in the championship for the 3rd year running. He's doing all right on these team matches. You're not giving him the place." And I got my place back then. And on that match where he said it was important for me to fish, he won the match. I think Phil was 2nd. And I ended up about 8th overall, and it was overall positions. And Wareham, for the very first time after many, many years, in fact we're going back nearly 40 years, Wareham won the Beymont Cup for the first time ever. So his faith was justified, and that was an important step. When we did fish the Stour, we were very much innocents, I think. We just fished it as we saw fit. Stour was very different in those days. You could, certainly on the upper Stour, it could be horrendous for minnows, very difficult to get past them. Further down the Stour, there were more other fish like bleak and so on. But we were coming on fast those first couple of years. To sort of sum up the success of those 2 first seasons as a senior, the first year I managed to win a match on breech with a tench and some small roach for about £3.5 in the summer, and that was my first senior match win, if you like. I won another match on breech in January. Funny time of year to go up there. In those days there were no bream, no rudd, no perch, and it was tough in the winter. You'd get a few roach, and that day I actually fished with casters, with a stick float, believe it or not. In 1973, I just dotted a stick float down and fished still water with that. It seems archaic now, but it worked. Had about a pound of quite reasonable sized roach. And there wasn't much caught apart from that. I think second weight was about 3 ounces. And then the final match of the season on the towpath, finally got a very good draw down there. And won a match with over 12 pounds of small dace. So ended that first senior season on a high. But as I've said earlier, not doing well in the John Emery match. I can't remember what I had that year. I think £1.50 a small dace, which was no real good. Struggled in another match on Holme Lane, and not fishing the first match meant I dropped down to about 3rd or 4th in the championship. The next season was tougher. I did eventually win a match. Matches on the towpath we usually pegged out, but we did get rover matches, and once or twice they were very tough, and they included the Dyke, which is a couple of 100 yards of a drainage ditch down there, a couple of foot deep, that I used to fish in the early 70s. Like canal fishing really. It's about 30 foot wide and 2.5 foot deep. Used to just fish little floats. and I made my own canal darts, and I'd sit there laying on with a maggot on a 20, fine wire 20, picking up a few roach. And in the first one, I think about £2 won on the towpath, but I had something like 1.11 for second, and no one took too much notice. I'd kept within the rules of a rover. I was allowed to move. I'd moved there, and a couple of other of my mates moved there as well, but people didn't notice. And then come the February, I did the same again. The towpath, although it could fish very well in the back end of the season, that day it was really grim for whatever reason, whether it was a bit clear. And I moved on to the dike, as did I think Richard and Phil. I think we were sort of first, second and third. And that really went down a storm. That was not possible. We're not having the dike in. Oh, it's not fair. And I'm thinking, well, you could move there. But the guys moaning had no concept of canal fishing or that style of fishing. Not that I was any great shakes as a canal angler, but I knew how to catch a few fish out of the dike. And these anglers with their 5BB porcupines weren't going to catch anything. They just, well, if you can't beat it, ban it, basically. That was the end of that. The following year, we were about to make a big step, and I'm going to leave that for the next video, which was to dip our toe into fishing open matches, which were much bigger matches with a much stronger field. Anglers come in from not just one club, but from all around. And that's the tale for the next time out. Until then, it's goodbye for now.